Sandhill Consultants is a diamond partner for Quest software. So a lot of the product sets that I'm going to talk about here have to do with Quest software. Now, efficient data management is crucial to all data-related activities, AI especially, right? So I've been to a number of different presentations today, and they all said the same thing. Fundamentally, you have to have good data, because you've got to put good data in to get good results out. So that's where this stuff begins. So when we talk about developing data, data modeling is one of the important tools you can use to develop data, mostly for relational databases. And this is where you start to implement things like standards, right? So if you start to decide, all right, I'm going to have a consistent abbreviation for customer, it's going to be CUST, let's say, for instance. And let's say you're going to use an ISO standard 11779-5 ISO standard, which basically is your metadata naming standards. Okay, that starts with doing data modeling, right? Because that gets you the consistency that you want to start to develop your data solutions. And of course, you always want to have some idea of how well your databases are performing. You know, the more data you collect, you might have to tune the database some more. So it's important to understand that. And of course, everybody needs to communicate on data integration, because if you have tons and tons of sources, and then you're trying to integrate them to some target, you want to have a mechanism by which we can all take a look and understand what those connections are going to be. And of course, monitoring. Everybody talks about the feedback loop. This is your feedback loop, right? This is where I created the database, I rolled it out, now I want to understand how well is it doing, right? Do I need to make any changes or modifications to that? So there's two products that fit into this. One is called Foglight, which is cross-platform, lots of different databases it works with. It'll do performance trends, capacity needs, stuff like that when you're doing your database development, gives you dashboards to monitor things, and it's scalable and flexible. The Spotlight Cloud lets you do monitoring for SQL Server, and you can do it in the cloud instance, so it doesn't have to be on-premise. Security, obviously, we want to be able to have security where we need it, right? So when we talk about security, we can talk about PII, we can talk about lots of different classifications for security. And that classification sort of relates back to, let's say, data governance. So maybe you have got to tag or flag things, but where does it get actually implemented is actually probably somewhere in the database. Who's allowed to access it? Do I do data masking? You know, what do I allow somebody to see based on the context of the role that they have? So it's important to understand that you have, at the lowest level, have to associate some sort of security mechanisms that relate back to the policies and the standards for GDPR, et cetera. So those things are important. So data discovery, what data do we have? Data classification, do we tag it? Do we flag it? Is it PII? Is it PCI? Is it whatever list of classifications I might have? Masking and redaction, who can see exactly what? You can see the employee table, but I'm not letting you see the salary column. That's going to be redacted, let's say. Auditing and compliance, obviously, when they come knocking and says, where did this come from? You have to be able to tell it, where did it come from? This has to do with those concepts of lineage that people were talking about earlier. And then workflow automation. So the automation of workflow is pretty important because, especially when we start talking about data governance, and we say who's responsible for what, right? So having a workflow where we have certain responsibilities, we can check off what we need to do within that particular task and then move it on to the next. And we can always go back and look at the workflow and understand exactly who did what when through that particular process. So I have a good way to audit things. So that's useful in building out your data. And of course, migration. We're on-prem, we want to go to the cloud, or we want some hybrid. How am I going to do that? So there has to be some utilities that allow us to understand that. So there are technologies that will let us replicate data so we can move it to a new location. We can have that replication going on simultaneously. Like, let's say, for instance, we want to be on-prem, but we're going to move to the cloud maybe next year. Maybe we'll run these two systems simultaneously, and then we'll cut over to the one that we want later. So we want to run them in tandem or parallel. Toad being a brand name, there are other features for performance and tuning there, benchmarking, Foglight we already talked about for monitoring, and Intelligence Central. So these things will all help you when doing data migrations. And then data preparations, right? So here's an important part that you need to understand, especially when it comes to AI and the whole garbage in, garbage out concept, right? When we start to say, I need to make sure that I have good data before I start putting it into AI. So you have to have good data preparation. Good data preparation has to do with data access preparation, data profiling, reporting, collaboration. Having all of these things together allows me to ensure that I have a certain level of acceptable data quality that I can now start to either train my model or load into some sort of engine to get me some kind of results. And this is the critical stuff, because so many, let's say, approaches or attempts to do AI end up with results that are less than optimal, not because your AI wasn't good, not because your AI model wasn't good, but because the data that you fed into it was not the best. So what you got out of it wasn't really up to what you wanted to get out of it. So just to summarize this to a certain degree, when we start looking at security, automating the identification of sensitive information makes it go a lot faster. Also, when you start to automate things like identification, it takes the human being out of it so that you won't miss things. The more you can automate for data governance, the better it is. Because a lot of people don't like to go through and say, okay, let's flag that one, let's flag this one. Or in one instance, it's called start date. In another instance, it's called effective date. What's a start date versus an effective date? I don't know. Should I flag that one and this one? So these are the things that you have to sort of work with. So finding the PCI stuff and PII stuff is good. Preparation, as I've already said, data profiling. What kind of data do we have? How good is it? Is it good enough to put into AI? Because as we know, when it comes to data quality, it's really data fit for use, right? So when you're doing these systems, it's really, well, it's for marketing purposes, and nobody's going to report it to the SEC for stocks and stock market stuff. So there's a difference between the level of data we need for that particular engine based on what we want to do with it. And then, of course, monitoring. This is the eternal feedback loop. If you don't have feedback loops, you'll never know whether you're going in the right direction. This has to do with business processes, has to do with data, has to do with AI, has to do with data governance. You always need to have some kind of feedback loop that gives you the information you need to decide, are we on the right track? Are we going left? Are we going right? What are we doing? And then migration, data moves. Data is always going to move. Today it's data in the cloud. Tomorrow will be data in outer space. Who knows? It's going to move, right? So we have to understand where it is and have mechanisms to move it around. And then, of course, development. This is where you do your data modeling, your benchmarking, these kinds of things. These all help you with going forward with AI. So just to sum it up, Quest has products to secure, prepare, monitor, migrate, and develop your data. And like I said, this is a fundamental type stuff. It's not the sexy AI stuff. Not going to give you charts and graphs, but what it will do is gives you that fundamental building blocks that says that we have data that's ready or good enough to load into AI. And if you are interested in learning more information, you can contact us at Sandhill Consultants. You can also go to the Quest website and find out information there. And then I'll just open up for general questions and answers. I know you guys are dying to ask me questions. I could tell by your faces. You're like, I know, I just can't reach what it was I want to say. But that's okay. Thank you all.
Yeah. I'm actually curious for both of you because you talked about AI. Joe kind of skirted around it. But when you're looking at data products, how in the past, say, 6 months, has AI either changed what you're doing or changed what you're being asked to do by clients? I mean, there's a hype cycle, obviously, about AI right now. I mean, exactly. But there was, this morning, Doug said something about, this is what people are being asked. The CEO will say, you know, how come we don't have some of that AI stuff? And is this something that you're seeing, and how are you dealing with that? And how would you advise the audience to deal with it? Because they may be being asked these questions too.
From my perspective, I've found that there's a renewed interest in the concept of data governance. Because AI projects...
Turn on the...
Oh,
you're not done. Yeah,
no,
well,
that's right,
well put the mic in your mouth.
Hang on, let me mic up here. Use the podium. Or I could use the podium. What I'm hearing now more again is data governance is coming back. I mean, data governance, we tried it once before, and people said, it's too top-down, command and control, telling me how to do my business. I don't care about that. But now, when you start saying, is it CUST, CUST, CSTMR, what's the difference between a buyer, a shopper, a consumer? You know, all of these things are coming up, and you're saying to yourself, I don't know, and I don't have enough information to make a decision. I actually have to get people in a room, and we have to talk to multiple different areas, right? Like if you think about customer, for instance, it's always a different context. Is it the guy who bought the product? Is it the guy who got the bill for the product? Is it the guy who's actually using the product? There's multiple different contexts for the same idea. And if you talk to one person, but not the others, you don't get that 360-degree definition. So that's where I see governance coming back. Joe?
So I agree on governance, but you said a magic word, which is context.
Context.
And that's really important in this discussion. So there is a study that was produced by, it was actually by a company called Data.World, but it's from some big names in the industry. One Cicada, if anyone follows Catalog and Cocktails, their podcast. Dean Almagang, who wrote a number of books on this. And they actually did a study of running AI against data versus running AI against data with a graph in front of it to help provide context. And for even simple questions, the improvement of accuracy of answering those questions was 3 times higher. Now, the ultimate numbers aren't wonderful, but if you go search for One Cicada or Data.World and look for the report, now they funded it, but it is truly done as an academic exercise. Juan was a professor at UT for a while. There's a wonderful report on working with data directly for an AI system versus working with it when you add context through a graph and metadata. So yes, governance is key because that's where you're getting that. And this report, if someone asks, tell me how to get funding for it, I actually hand them this report.
Yeah, I mean, it's
pretty simple.
It's a lot of that is governance. Yeah.
I want to ask, how do you realize that context that you're building? You can accumulate information about your data, but how do you make it effective? How do you use it effectively when you are browsing?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
So the question is, how do you realize that context on your data when you're browsing? Well, what I would argue is, I mean, there's a small set of people in certain roles that will look directly at the data. In my mind, what you should be searching for is those entities or things that are part of the business, and from them, they should tell you what data you should get. In other words, the idea of us asking our business users to read the tables that we work with is, I don't know, kind of comical, right? When we think of it, it's probably all we had, but that's it. So I would say they're not looking at the data, they're looking at the semantic layer that's converting it to something that is in their terms.
Right, and that's where the context comes in, where it's like, I'm a salesperson and I want to know all the customers in my territory is a different kind of question than how many customers brought red widgets from us last year? Two totally different contexts, same idea, customer, what I want to know about customer. So that's what Joe's sort of getting at, is that the contextual surroundings actually adds a lot of value than just, I do a lot of, when working with customers, just dealing with synonyms, It's like synonyms, it's like, okay, you called it X, you called it Y, you called it Z. What do we all agree that it is? All right, well, throw a hand grenade in the middle of the room, because that's, that's what you're going to get. The other part of it that's even worse is homonyms. We use the same word, but they're completely different definitions. Now, I have a story. I was at a railroad down in Texas, and I thought I was asking a simple question. I said, so what's a train? So they said, well, on the track or off the track? I was like, what? There's a difference between the train being on a track? Goes, oh, yeah. If it's off the track, maybe it's not a train. Well, if it's on the track, then it's a train. All right, well, what if it doesn't have cars? It's just an engine. Is it still a train? Well, it all depends on the guy who gets paid to have cars versus the guy who doesn't. It's all context. And you'll have these discussions, and this is why, as Joe was saying, you got to get the people in the room. You have to have a meeting. And sometimes you can't come to one decision on this is what a train is. So then you have to get into these what he called taxonomies and ontologies. You say, there are kinds of trains. And then we can all agree that these kinds of trains are the way we want to start talking about it. Because if you say, no, we have to have one definition and only one, forget it. It's never going to work. You have to be able to say, in your context, it's an X train. In your context, it's a Y train. Then you can get agreement. Then you can move forward. Because that's really, if I have to summarize all of this data stuff down, it comes to a common agreement. If you can agree, you can move forward. If you can't agree, you can't go anywhere.
Even on a train.
Even on a train. As a matter of fact, that train ain't moving. I was like, I took the subway in, and they said, sorry, we're going to start a train on train. It's like 10 minutes. I'm going, what's causing this train? It's only going from A to B and back again. But that's the way it is with transit.
Okay. We got a little off track there, but but join me in thanking Joe and Jeff for a very educational session.